Hey, I'm Jessica. This week we read Dr. Wegman's book, An American Color. I don't know why I'm showing you the book. You want to know what the book looks like? About race and identity in New Orleans and then in the wider Atlantic world. Uh, Obviously, since we read an entire book, it's not the same as just reading some articles. So it's a lot of information. There are a lot of ideas and themes and things to talk about and questions to ponder. So I tried to just kind of make some notes that made kind of semi-logical sense and were kind of connected. So two major themes that I saw while I read the book were the idea of social versus legal realities of racial identity, and specifically the idea of social realities coming first and then being followed by legal realities. And then another major theme I saw that was kind of the point of the book is talked about in the introduction, is the idea of an intentionally carved out, fought for, and eventually self-defined, distinct social group, in this case, in this book, Creoles of color in New Orleans, but also the idea of people of color and specifically of African descent across the southern United States, including places like Virginia, the Carolinas, things like that. I really like how he put it on page 3 when he used the terms self-conscious and identifiable. So those are kind of two main things I'm going to talk about. I'm sure I'll remember things as I go and jump around a little and bring up some other things. But talking about that first theme with the social versus legal realities, on page 7 in paragraph 2, we see it talking about how, in order to tell the full story of what Dr. Wegman calls this meeting of divergent social, cultural, and racial environments across North America, we can't just look at written laws. We can't just see what the rule book said, what court records said, things like that. We also have to look at how these diverse groups of people, or even just individual people, interacted with each other just kind of on a daily basis. And then in addition to that, we have to look at how laws were actually implemented and enforced, because we know that there are some laws even today that are on the books that are just kind of ignored and we pretend like they're not there. And so we can see throughout the book how during all these changing concepts and legalities of race and racial groups, and page 9, it says society worked faster than law. And that was kind of something that I thought made sense, because if you think about it kind of in a linear pattern, you can think of how society is going to have values and mores that develop and grow and evolve over time. More and more people are going to kind of come on board with that. Those new values are going to gain momentum, kind of hit a critical mass, or just get enough support in the higher, echelons of society. And then those values and mores eventually get codified into law. But then, through reading the book and just kind of thinking about real life, I guess my first question is it true that law always follows society? Or is it only true in this specific context when we're talking about the development of a definition of a racial class and of a specific social class? So does law always follow society, or does sometimes society follow law? And if sometimes society does follow law, what does that look like? What are some examples of that? Should it always be one way or the other? Is it okay if it's both? That all that. And then in chapter 2, in the section on page 41 about reforming the systema, about my pronunciation there, we see a discussion about how Spanish lawmakers were conflicted about how to legislate the identity of people with mixed racial backgrounds. This section is specifically talking about people with Spanish and African backgrounds. And to me, this suggests that if the lawmakers were confused about exactly how to legislate this, then that means that there was already existing confusion in society, because if there was already a strict definition and a strict go-to code for this, then the lawmakers would have just put that into law. It would have been codified. So there's still a confusion under the Spanish system that there was under the French system, which I realize that I haven't talked about yet, but I will. So chapter 1 discusses the French system, and under that there was also confusion over who was black, who was white, who was free, who was enslaved. Chapter 1 talks about, how to define an indentured servant, that kind of thing, who counted as mixed race. Do we use the term mulatto? What term do we use? In both the French and Spanish system, there was all of this confusion in the law. And the reason there's confusion in the law is because there's confusion in society as well. So even though the Spanish system attempted to apply more math and nuance, there was still the same issue. And then skipping way ahead in the book to chapter 5, the last chapter, at the bottom of page 123, let me see, I think I want to, just a minute. I want to make sure I quote this. At the bottom of 123, it talks about how this is in the section talking about how in the 1850s you start seeing an uptick of the enforcement of laws that had already been on the book, racial laws that had already been on the book. And so this section is going back and talking about how a lot of these laws about how to define race and rights and things like that had been on the books for a while, even almost 100 years, but had fallen to the wayside as face-to-face interaction and local reputation and character held sway over the enforcement of laws designed to universalize treatment of certain social, racial, and cultural groups. So we can see there that that's a situation where there were laws in place, but because society had, I guess we would kind of consider it now, progressed, society had progressed past those laws, at least momentarily, since it was kind of a relapse during that time. You can see once again where the face-to-face interactions, the real life societal interactions, really held more sway than the law did, at least for a time being. And I think this idea of law versus, or at least before or after, society really connects to that other theme I talked about, which is the idea of an intentionally carved out and identifiable racial group, because you can see throughout the book how the group that would eventually become Creoles of color, how they changed, kind of, not to consider a whole group a monolith, but, if we're considering a group as a whole, how they kind of changed what their definition was, what the goals of the society was, the goals of the group. Sorry about the background noise. My cat's locked out of the room and he doesn't approve of the situation. But how the way Creoles of color sought to identify themselves and sought to find their place in society changed based on whether the city was under the French system or the Spanish system, or then later the American system, and what was deemed as safe, and what the goals were. And so part of that comes down to what I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the video, which is the differences between the French system and the Spanish system. So you have, oh no, my notes are out of order. So you have the French system coming from, Enlightenment thinkers, and even Thomas Jefferson himself, who in chapter 1 on page 22, we see his idea of racial bleaching, where the French system was based on the idea of basically getting rid of, as awful as that sounds, I mean, that's what they were trying to do, getting rid of this mixed race group by trying to eventually make them white. You have Thomas Jefferson doing straight up math trying to use genetics and things like that to decide after what generation is somebody considered white, pure white, versus the Spanish system, which is basically saying the opposite. You have the French system saying, well, the goal is to eventually make these people white, but then you have the Spanish system saying they'll never be white no matter what, which, is where we get the one drop kind of rule that eventually became the standard in America, especially in Southern America, up to and then after the Civil War. So you have this group of people who, under the French system, where in chapter 1 we can see we're seeking to try to marry in such a way that their children would become more and more white, because that was perceived as what was desirable and what was going to be safe and enable them to be prosperous in the future. Whereas after New Orleans specifically, and it's true for other areas, but specifically in New Orleans, after you have the Spanish come in with the sistema, with their caste system, this is when we see on page 35, which I think was in the introduction, maybe, you have it's now not possible to become white because you'll never be considered white no matter how many generations there are. And so this is when we see this group become Creole. So it's interesting how, you see the same exact group of people with the same background go from having one goal to another goal, but both goals were grounded in this is what's going to keep us safe. This is what's going to help us find our place in society. And I mentioned a bit ago the Enlightenment thinkers, and how the Enlightenment thinkers really influenced both of these ways of thinking. But it got me thinking about all the Enlightenment readers we've read in this class. And I guess another question is, how do these ideas of race, and specifically what the book talks about as being racial science, these ideas of trying to scientifically quantify and categorize everything in the natural world, including at this point people, these debates about race and what makes race race, and if different races or different species and things like that. How do those connect back to the readings we've already done in this class? And I specifically kept thinking about Buffon's The Rat, which I think was mentioned in the book, but I didn't write down the page. So that's a question, is how do these ideas of race and this so-called racial purity and the definition of what makes race race and things like that, how do you see either the precursors to that in the Enlightenment readings we've done in class so far, or even not precursors? Do you see any evidence of just straight up that thought process in the readings we've had so far? Sorry for me looking wildly around. I didn't think there were any cats in the room, but there was one, and he appeared. So getting back to the book, so you had the French system and the Spanish system both present in New Orleans at a certain time, and then obviously eventually New Orleans became part of America and then necessarily developed an American system. And I think it's interesting that it seems like the Spanish system overall kind of won out, because you have, under the American system, this same idea, or not even the same idea, kind of a more strict idea, because the Spanish system was a lot more fluid with percentages and things like that. Whereas with the American system, especially as you get more into the mid 1800s, it becomes very much just black or white, which is why you see the Creoles of color, free Creoles of color, fighting so hard to define themselves as different, as a separate and unique entity in society. So it's interesting, and I kind of wonder, I guess that's another question I have, is why did this whole one drop system went out over the idea that we even had a president support of, racial bleaching, which I feel, it's icky to say, but so why did that went out over, the more French system? And then another question is, I guess it's kind of a I kind of like what if history questions. I'm kind of interested in what would free Creoles of color look like as a group in society today if we hadn't had the Sistema in New Orleans, if the French system had kind of still had strong roots in the city when the city became American. And the more Spanish definition of race, I think, definitely did win out. I'm not saying completely. They kind of got melded, the two systems, but I think we see a lot more of that than we do ultimately the French definition, because you see in chapter 5, looking at kind of the backlash and the tightening up of racial definitions leading up to the Civil War, and just prior to the Civil War in the 1850s, we see on page 128 that there was a lot of anti-free Black legislation that's intent was to consolidate all free people of color into one highly structured, controlled caste. And then the next sentence says people of mixed race, those often left outside of racialized legislation, stood at the heart of this ethnographic revival. So the idea is, they were trying to white lawmakers were trying to make it so that the legal definitions were very, very strictly Black or white. And then you had this by now very firmly established and defined and known group of people who very clearly did not fit into either of those groups. Another thing that I really thought was interesting while reading this, and reading especially those last two chapters, chapter 4 and 5, were how the free Creoles of color, how they managed to define themselves under the American system after the city was fully part of America. Even in the very beginning of the book, in the introduction on page 2, we see that at that point this group of people were very firmly established. We also see throughout the book, we see free Creoles of color owning slaves and, kind of looking towards the white upper class initially. But then in chapter 5, we see looking at the newly developed white middle class for kind of cues on what morals were going to be what they needed to really focus on in order to carve out a place in society. So, I said in chapters 4 and 5 is where we're really seeing this American system really fully in place. But even going back in time to chapter 3, looking at Louisiana, New Orleans directly after the Louisiana Purchase, when they're first becoming part of America, you can see Creoles of color seeing the need to prove themselves as virtuous and possessing, middle class morality and being upstanding members of society as a way to justify themselves and their existence, even as they're still on the outskirts of white society, not able to fully join. And they did this, even as it says in on page 61, without the promise of citizenship. 62 specifically says that this attainment of morality and loyalty and things like that would lead to them as loyal subjects, but even then not full citizens. But their very safety as a group and as individuals, I think, depended on melding themselves into kind of almost parallel to the white middle class. They weren't going to be able to make themselves a part of it under the racial rules that had kind of solidified by then, but they could at least show themselves to be parallel to, below the white upper class, in some instances, I guess, perceived by society to be below even the white middle class, but still holding themselves above the the group of enslaved people, above people who were considered closer to African descent than they were considering themselves. This kind of reminded me of the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus, the idea of, them making the wings out of wax and then trying to fly away. And, it's the idea of don't fly too close to the sun or, the wax will melt. So, don't try to put yourself into white society. That can be dangerous because it could be seen as a threat. The white people are going to get threatened, but also don't fly too close to the sea because then the water will get your wings wet and weigh you down. So still holding yourselves up above a class of workers or even enslaved laborers to show yourself as above them. So it was a very kind of precarious balance that we see even at the very beginning of the book, when the very beginning of the intro on page 2 talks about a free Creole of color expressing fears that the Confederates coming during the Civil War would universalize freedom and liberty. So you can see this idea that they're afraid that if everyone has this freedom and liberty, then it's going to take away their definition as a people group. And during the same time period, we're also seeing kind of more evidence of how the law follows society, or the law comes under society sometimes. And specifically, the court cases talked about on page 70, the cases of Battles and Ferguson, who are two men of color, and specifically free men of color, who are in court cases where they're basically, even though the law should not allow them to be given the rights that they are given, even though under the law it seems like the court should not be ruling in their favor, because society, the society of the city knew them face to face, saw them as upright members of society, kind of treated them as more white than the law would allow. So you can kind of see how those two themes tie into each other. As a complete side note, just because I was just talking about the Louisiana Purchase a minute ago, I thought it was interesting to read about America and the American Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase from the point of view of New Orleans, because having never lived in any of the territory involved in the Louisiana Purchase, I feel like I'd never looked at it from that point of view. It was always taught to me as something that happened to that territory instead of something that happened to this territory. So I'm interested in if that's something that any of y'all thought about, or if you have other experiences, or if you had studied it from a different perspective than me. I just thought that was really interesting. I also realized reading the book, especially chapter 1, that I don't think I'd ever really studied a lot about the founding of New Orleans. I think in my head it was just kind of illogically always existed as a city. It just kind of sprang forth fully developed, I guess. So that's just, like I said, just kind of a side note, not really a major theme of the book, but just something that I thought about while I was reading it. So I guess in closing, did you notice any themes in the book that I didn't? Do you think I misinterpreted a theme of the book? Do you disagree with any of the things I said? Did you agree with any of the things that I said? What do you think about the idea of the free Creoles of color, specifically in New Orleans having to kind of perform. I think that word's used in chapter 4. Yeah, on page 115, the idea of having to perform an educated, professional, middle class identity in order to kind of gain that distinction in society and that safety and the ability to be prosperous. What do you think?